Hello and welcome back to High School History. And Kian, we are right here, so don't get so impatient. We are dot on time, I think. And let's start off for the day. We're very excited to be presenting one of India's amazing historical authors. And before we introduce her, I just want to
We're
say
very
that
excited
one
to
of
be
the
presenting
best
one.
ways. Oops, hang on. Some technical issue. Yeah, I think this is better now. There's no back echo. Right. So Abdul Latif was a 12th century scholar from Baghdad, and he said that the best way to study or the best education is by travel. And if you can't travel, the next best thing to do is read history, read biographies, and study the experiences of nations. So we are going to do just that today, since traveling is out of the question given the COVID-19 situation. But I hope all of you are safe, and I'm going to ask Ujwala to now take us into the introductory section of our author of the day.
Good evening,
Ujwala.
everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ujwala Shankar, President of Sanskriti School's Heritage Club MIIRAAS, and I'm so pleased to have Miss Ira Mukhoty here with us today. Miss Mukhoty has pursued natural sciences from Cambridge University, and she is an accomplished author of historical nonfiction. She has written Heroines, Powerful Indian Women of Myth and History, wherein she talks about women like Draupadi and Radha from myth, and Mirabai, Razia Sultan, among others from history, who have been glorified in popular culture by belittling the complexities of their characters. And she's also written Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens, and Begums of the Mughal Empire, where she talks about the remarkable lives led by women in Mughal harems and how they've been fetishized or completely erased by historians. In her newest book, Akbar the Great Mughal, through various sources such as the works of Abul Fazl Badayuni, accounts of Jesuits, and a nuanced interpretation of miniature paintings, she traces the life of Akbar from his early life and ancestry to the consolidation of his empire, right up until his last years, which was surrounded by death and rebellion, all the while putting a modern spin to it. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us. We're truly very honored, and we can't wait to hear more.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sanskriti School. Thank you, Ms. Sanchita Ghosh. Thank you, Ujwala, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to all the children who are joining in. I am so admiring of all of you taking time off after your school is over to join in these kind of sessions. So as Ujwala was saying, I'm a writer of narrative history. So this is a sort of a new genre in India, shall we say. On the one hand, you have the academic writing. So we have a lot of that. We have a very rich academic history. But somehow that has not translated in great numbers to historical nonfiction in a narrative way for the lay audience, people such as, yourselves who may just be interested in history. In the last few years, that has been changing. Of course, we have the great example of Mr. Dalrymple, and he has been followed by quite a few other people in recent years, who have been writing Parvati Sharma, Ruby Lal, many Manu Pillai, and many other writers who have taken on this task of, making history interesting as well as, of course, factual. So my great aim in writing this sort of history is not to just write the broad strokes of history, not just say for Akbar the administration, the land revenue system, how he governed, and the Mansabdari system. Of course, these were important things, but I am also interested at the same time in the minutiae of history, in the details of the man, the finer details, the shading, if you like, what made him vulnerable, what were the mistakes he made, who were the people who surrounded him. And also, I want people to get my readers to get a real feel for the geography of the times that they're reading about. What was it like in a very visceral, physical manner? So for that, to be able to do something like that, here are the sources of Mughal history in general. I hope everyone can see the second slide fine. So the first three sources, if we look at those first three sources, those are the classical sources that we use for Mughal history. So on the one hand, you have the Persian writing. So we have a very rich amount of Persian writings, especially for the time of Akbar. We have the famous Abu al-Fazl, we have Badauni, we have Nizamuddin Ahmed, Kandahari, and many more. Now, when you look at a source of history, what you must keep in mind is who is writing it. What sort of a person is he? Is he very educated, not educated? Does he have a grudge? Why is he writing this history? You have to also see who is his patron, who has commissioned the work. Is it an emperor, or is it the person writing for himself? And then the third thing you have to keep in mind is who is the intended audience. So once you have these three things in mind, you can have a clearer idea of how to judge that source. So, for example, Abu al-Fazl was writing because the emperor asked him to, and Abu al-Fazl was greatly admiring of the emperor. So that will give a certain filter to Abu al-Fazl's writing, whereas Badauni was critical of Akbar's, religious experimentation. So that gives a completely different nuance to Badauni's writings. Then we have the Jesuit writings. Now, these were educated men, Christian men who were coming to India to try and convert people, and maybe even convert the Pacha and his courtiers and his sons. So this is important when we look at the Jesuit writings. There were also European travelers starting at around this time, in the end of the 16th century, to come to India, drawn by the riches of India, as we know, trying to carry out trade. Now, here in India, we must keep in mind, and I especially am very mindful of this, is that we tend to have absorbed these writings to a greater extent in our public consciousness. The European writings, because they came to us in English, were translated into English, were easily accessible, whereas the Persian sources were not. So we have, in a subconscious way, adopted some of these prejudices and nuances about especially the ones that the Europeans left with us. For example, that the harem was a degraded space, that the women had no power, which I have covered a lot in Daughters of the Sun. But it is something that I always keep in mind while writing. So for me, what is also very important, in addition to these sources, are the other lesser known writings. So for example, Gulbadan's Humayunama. So Gulbadan, who was Babur's daughter, Humayun's sister, and Akbar's aunt, wrote a biography of her father and her brother. And this is an extremely important point of view from a woman, So from within the Mughal harem, we get a view, if you like, a window into how these women led their lives, how they were influential, and the ways in which they were able to shape empire as well. So for me, this remains a very valuable source of information. We'll come back to it in a bit. Then you have sources like the Rajput sources. Now, the Rajputs, in a certain way, were the so-called, the conquered people. So it's always interesting to see how these people who were absorbed into the Mughal Empire, how did they write about their negotiation with the emperor, with the Mughal Empire? What was their point of view? How did they adapt to this changing scenario? There were the Jain and the Sikh writings, which are very interesting because where, for example, the Persian writings don't even record the interaction with the Sikh gurus, whereas for the Sikh gurus and the Sikh Panth, this was extremely important. So they have very long, very tender and evocative narratives of Akbar meeting the gurus and being very kind and generous towards them. But the Persian writers, for them, it was almost a blip in the landscape, so they didn't record this. The Sanskrit sources are another unusual source that we can look at. Then there's market gossip, there's popular myths like the Akbar Birbal stories. How much truth is there in this? Other things like that. The Navratna stories. There's architecture, which is a very interesting source to look at, because this stays for centuries unchanged in a way. You can look at the writings on the important monuments. You can look at the sort of iconography used, and we can get a lot of nuanced interpretation. And lastly, there are the Mughal paintings. So this is something that I want to focus on in today's talk, is the way in which Mughal paintings have been very useful to me in my own work. And for this, we are all very grateful to the amazing work done by art historians in the last few decades. They have done amazing work. We tend to think of history as a static thing, something which doesn't change for hundreds of years, that information is there. But this is not true. Scholars keep discovering new things. Like you may have seen in the papers recently, there's some kind of furor about Davashiko's tomb having been perhaps identified by somebody. And that's causing a lot of talk, in the academic circles. So things keep changing. We find new information, and art historians especially are doing that amazingly nowadays. So one point, since I talked about the sources of women's writing, I wanted to quickly point out Gulbadan Begum's biography. So when Akbar decided that he wanted to have this great biography of himself written in the late 1580s, he called, of course, Abu al-Fazl to write this amazing work that he did write, but he also asked some other people to write their personal recordings, because obviously Abu al-Fazl had not himself experienced life under Humayun. So he asked, one of the people he asked was Gulbadan Gulbadan, his aunt, who had had a very long life, who had lived through, of course, Babur's career, and I think was about 6 years old when Babur died. And then she lived through all of Humayun's career, and then she was living with Akbar at Agra and then Fatehpur Sikri. So he asked his aunt to write this record, and she wrote this amazing document. It is said she wrote it in robust Persian with sprinkling of Turki words because her mother tongue was Turki, and she wrote about all her experiences of being a woman in the Mughal harem under Babur and then Humayun, about how the journeyings happened, how their life carried on, how they influenced decisions, how they were able negotiators, how they were diplomats. But the amazing thing is that after she wrote this, and there was probably only ever one copy made of this book, it disappeared completely from public consciousness. Nobody remembered that she had written this book. Abu al-Fazl didn't really, refer to it. Later, biographers coming along, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, they never referred to Gulbadan's book and said, oh, according to Gulbadan. So little by little, over the centuries, people forgot about it, and it physically disappeared as well. Nobody recollected anymore that there was this woman who had written about the Mughal harem from within it. Centuries passed, and sometime in the 19th century, during the British Raj, a British man was wandering around collecting old manuscripts. He had a love for doing that, and he bought thousands of manuscripts. And then he died, and his widow wanted to raise some money, so she returned to England and sold 1,000 of these manuscripts to the British Library. And there they remained for some decades, till in the beginning of the 20th century, some of them were translated by Annette Beveridge into English, and she discovered this document called Gulbadan's biography, the Hamzanama. And she brought this back into our memory. But it was still ignored by biographers, by historians for many, many decades, till one academic called Ruby Lal really examined it very closely and wrote a book about it, in which she described the way in which the women were powerful from within the harem and what the harem consisted of. And so I was able to use Ruby Lal's book a lot in my earlier book as well, and in this book. But I wanted to point this out just to bring to your attention the fact that when women write things, it tends to be very fragile and easily lost. So when you are told that there is no source for women's histories, no source for women's writings, you must always question that. It's very likely untrue. It's more that those writings have been forgotten. Another thing that I wanted to point out here, which we have again inherited from a colonial mindset. We tend to think of Humayun as a bit of a dilettante, somebody who just enjoyed opium and the company of his women. But this is not quite the real picture. As we see from this beautiful, manuscript, which dates to around 1546, it is now believed to be the earliest painting from the Mughal atelier. And this is from Humayun's time. So we can see already one thing, which was, patently untrue, is that Humayun was in fact very interested in art, and the Mughal school of miniature painting actually began under Humayun and not under Akbar, which is commonly assumed. And that even when he was wandering in desperate circumstances, he always kept painters in his entourage. This was something which was very important to him. The fact that he was a dilettante is often a colonial point of view. They think, okay, he didn't do anything very much. He was in Kabul, which was outside India. But remember, at that time, there's no sense of a national boundary such as it is today. Kabul was very much part of the empire that was considered Hindustan, and actually Kabul was the first of the Mughal empires. So this painting, which was originally called Humayun and His Brothers, is set in Kabul. And as it usually, the way it usually works out is you tend to think of the men, and you see Humayun there in the lower half, and you say, oh, this must be Humayun and his brothers, or in quite a pretty landscape sort of environment. But in fact, that is not the case. Some scholars, Laura Parodi amongst others, have looked very intently at this picture, at this miniature, and have found some amazing information from it. And if you look closely at the middle left section and then the upper left section, you can see two groups of women. And if I close in on them here, you will see on the left, these women have actually all been identified by their clothes, by the imperial sort of costumes they're wearing, the colors they're wearing, and the jewelry they're wearing. And the scholars believe them to be Akbar's mother, the one who is sitting in the green, Hamida Banu Begum. There's probably Gulbadan herself and her sister, Gulchira Begum, and maybe another wife called Bega Begum. On the right, we have what are the milk mothers. So Akbar, when he was left at a young age, around 2, he was left, and his parents went on to Persia. He was looked after by his milk mothers, Gigi Anga and Mahamanga, who had a great influence later on in his life. And we understand that influence when we see him here. That's him probably in the orange shirt. We understand this influence when we see that these women guarded him with their lives at such a vulnerable stage. So putting this painting back, we see that in fact it is not necessarily the men who are here in focus, it is actually the women. And what is being celebrated here probably are the rites around the circumcision of Akbar. So the circumcision of a prince was a very important time in his life, and there were fertility rites around this time which bring into focus the women. So this image reminds us that in many ways, all these individual women, these women who later became the great matriarchs of Akbar's reign, were extremely important from an earlier time. Now, another thing that I noticed, which was very interesting for me, was when I was trying to figure out the problem of Akbar's illiteracy. Now, as you know, this is something that scholars have thought about a lot, and we wonder, how could he have been illiterate? A man who was later on, so erudite, and he valued painting and writing. He loved to have books read out to him. How was he illiterate? So the first thing to remember is that in the 16th century, this was not necessarily a negative thing. Today, when we think of illiteracy, we think of a degraded condition, somebody who didn't have access to money, who didn't have access to education. But in the 16th century, they were able to spin it in a different way, and they in fact said that Akbar was illiterate, but he was illiterate like the Prophet Muhammad and like Timur, their great ancestor. And despite that, he was such an erudite man, which meant that his knowledge came from a higher source. So that was one thing to keep in mind. But secondly, I was still wondering that how did this happen, that he actually could not read and write? And I was wondering if he was perhaps a very energetic kid, somebody who we would today describe as being somebody suffering from attention deficit disorder in a way. But then I looked at this painting, which is now believed to show a young Akbar. So if you can, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this, if I zoom in here, this young boy in the orange shirt, this is Akbar himself presenting a painting to Humayun, who is sitting across from him. And scholars have looked at this painting that he's holding, and in fact, it is a painting within a painting. It is a painting of this very image. So they have deduced that in fact, Akbar is presenting a painting to Humayun of this very image, which means that this is a very important image and was probably also painted by Akbar himself. He probably contributed to this painting with the great Persian master. Which brings us to an important thing. If Akbar was able to paint, now painting was something which, if I look at the next image, this is a painting of a painter, and you can see how concentrated he is, how he's hunched over his board, how he has to sort of scrunch himself up into this small space for hours and hours at a time. Now, miniature painting was not something like modern art today, which you can throw on a few splashes of paint. You had to work at it for days, weeks, sometimes a month to finish a painting. So if Akbar was able to do this, I was wondering if he was able to bring his attention to this intense work of creativity, then I think he probably did not suffer from attention deficit disorder, and it is more likely that he suffered from something perhaps like dyslexia, which meant that he could not identify alphabets, but painting was not an issue for him. So this was another very interesting thing that I found by looking at paintings. So what I basically want to take you through today is the life of Akbar divided into different phases using the great works of art that he sponsored. Because for me, this was an interesting and important way in which I could add to my information that I had about the different phases of Akbar's life. Now, in phase 1, this is a painting from a work called the Hamzanama. Akbar commissioned this when he was very young, only about 20 years old in 1562. And it is a work which changed the face of Mughal art forever, because in one go, he decided to commission a work which resulted in 1,400 paintings. It took 15 years to complete it. They had 12 bound volumes when they were done with it. And by then, an entire atelier had been trained. And the work that he chose to commission is The Adventures of Amir Hamza. Now, this was quite an obscure work at the time, but Akbar enjoyed it very much because it was a very rambunctious, roistering tale of Hamza as he goes through many adventures, a little bit like Lord of the Rings, I would imagine. And so a lot of things that a young man would be interested in, such as this dragon that he has to slay and, go and rescuing a princess. And so you get a real sense of the physicality of Akbar, the sort of things that interested him when he was a young man in his 20s. And indeed, at this time, he was engaged in a lot of battles. He had to encourage his men to battle. So these sort of stories were very useful for him. Another thing to remember and is interesting about the Hamzanama is that this is not a tiny work of art. This is almost 1 meter high. Each individual painting was painted on a board almost a meter high. And as you had the storyteller telling you the story of Hamza, they were called Kissa Khwans, in front of him, a man would hold up these boards with these images corresponding to the episode that the Kissa Khwan was narrating. So it is a little bit like theater. So the guys would keep holding these huge drawings and changing them as the story evolved. So this is the sort of work that Akbar was interested in this phase of his life. This is again another image from the same work, the Hamzanama. Again, you can see quite a crazy sort of situation. This man is stuck on the top of a minaret, and you're wondering how is he going to escape from here. The other people are bowing to 2 men who look like Jain monks, and there's all sorts of interesting things happening here as well. So this was a period when Akbar was extremely involved in battles. And so what else could I find in terms of information that I could use? What kind of source? And this was his armor that I found at the Bombay Museum, the CSMVS Museum. And it was fascinating because, to see an actual object that somebody has worn who you're writing about 500 years ago, 450 years ago, it's a very moving experience. And this is a beautiful work. It's a Damascene work, which is gold on metal. It's beautifully finished, beautifully made with carving. And what was interesting to me is that it was not very big. Now, it was quite broad, but it was not very high. So probably Akbar was not a very tall man. And this corresponds when I read to his son Jahangir's description of him, when he says, "My father was middle height, but inclining to be tall. He was of wheatish complexion, and his eyes and eyebrows were black, and his features were more refined than merely handsome. He was slender-waisted with a broad chest." And the Jesuits who write about him also say, "This prince is of a stature and of a type of countenance well fitted to his royal dignity," so that one could easily recognize, even at first glance, that he is the king. He has broad shoulders, somewhat bandy legs, well suited for horsemanship. So this tied in very well to this armor that I found. I also tried to imagine at this time of his life, he was very involved in battles. And so for me, sitting here, an urban woman, never having participated in anything vaguely physical like this, it's difficult to imagine. And yet I wanted my readers, when they read my scenes of battle, to be drawn into the scene, to experience what it must have felt like, the terror and the horror of a battle. So I looked at online to see what I could find. And this on the left is the only remaining entire elephant armor that we have in the world, and it's in the Leeds Armory in the UK. And so this was amazing for me to see, because the descriptions often say, oh, that these were terrifying animals. And now you can see why they would have been terrifying when you look at the armor on them, and remember that they often had daggers tied to their tusks, and they were trained to catch soldiers and throw them in the air. They were also trained to catch horses and throw them in the air with their trunks. On the right, you have a soldier, so you can see how his horse has also got armor, how the soldier has armor, and it made me think about how hot they must have felt when often the battles were fought in the middle of an Indian summer, which is what Akbar did. He didn't wait for the winter season, which is what others usually did. So these were very important to me when I was writing about my battle scenes. Something else that was important to me when writing about battles is the many ways in which boats are shown in Mughal miniatures. So this is a scene from the Akbarnama, which we'll come to later, but very interesting to see that the men also fought from boats, and we don't tend to think of the Mughal Empire as being an empire which used a lot of ships. We tend to think of it as a landlocked so-called army, but in fact they used boats a lot because of the huge rivers of India. And so I was able to write of one particular battle that Akbar carried out against Daud Khan Afghan, Hindustan, in which he travels from Agra all the way to Patna, simply using ships and boats. So this for me was very useful to see how he was doing that, and to bring out the fact that in India we may not have had very many seaworthy ships, but we did have a great deal of boats for the rivers. And these were not just flimsy boats either. If you look here, you can see on the right how they were used to transport horses. You can see a horse there in the middle in one of the boats, and they also used them to transport elephants. So they must have been very sturdy boats to be able to do that all the way down, a river system. On the left, it was useful to me because often they would say when we were going to a different state, to a different part of the country to carry out a battle, and there were never any bridges. So they constructed a bridge of boats, and it was difficult for me to imagine what they meant by a bridge of boats. But in this miniature on the left, you can see how the boats are lashed together, and then on top of the boats, they sort of put a bedding sort of planks and of mats and of straw, and elephants can actually cross on that. And Akbar was very careful about his logistics. He was excellent in planning and logistics, which is also a very important part of battle. You have to think ahead to how you're going to get your army across. And the Jesuits wrote about how carefully he planned his journeys, how carefully he got his animals and his people and his horses to cross rivers. So this was important for me to see. Another thing that was important from a miniature of this time, to understand what was happening at this time, was one of the famous battles, was the battle for Ranthambore. After Chittor, the Chittor and Ranthambore were the two great Rajput victories that Akbar carried out in quick succession. And after that, a lot of the Rajput clans came over to the Mughal Empire. So this on the left depicts the Battle of Ranthambore. After it was finished quite quickly, Raja Surjan Hada capitulated quite quickly because he had seen what had happened at Chittor. He didn't want the same thing to happen to him. So here, the Akbarnama depicts this very sympathetically. You can see in the middle, if my cursor is working, you can see Akbar right in the middle, and Surjan Hada is in front of him, and he's bowing down, and Akbar is very kindly and sympathetically putting his hand on his shoulder. So you can see that Akbar is actually understanding how hard it is for the Raja to come over, and he's showing a lot of compassion for him. On the other hand, at exactly the same time, Surjan Hada himself, he is having a Surjan Charita written for him in Sanskrit, and they are writing a very different version. Instead of admitting that they have lost and that they must join the Mughal Empire, they write that actually Surjan Hada just gave over Ranthambore, and he was given 3 pieces of land instead of Ranthambore. So for him, it was actually a win-win situation. He got more land that he originally had. So this was interesting when I compared the two to see how the Rajputs were negotiating a new reality in which their kings were no longer all powerful, and they had to learn how to submit to an emperor and the ways in which they could do it without losing face. Now in phase 2, I wanted to show you this example. It is the Persian version. On the left, it is a page from the Anwar-e-Sohaili, which is a Persian translation of the Panchantantra. So it is a moral fable using a lot of animals. And this, for me, represents what Akbar was going through at this stage of his life in the 1570s. Here he was having a very experiential, way in which he was dealing with his empire. So he loved animals. He caught many cheetahs himself. He learned how to train them. He brought them into his entourage. They learned how to catch wild elephants. And he was very interested in experiencing his land, his new land that he was taking over. And it is said also that he used to go to villages in disguise so that he could learn about his people. So this represents this phase of Akbar's life for me. And it is, it is quite unusual in Persian art to have animals at the center of a painting, the center of attention of a painting, but it became very common in Mughal art because the Mughal emperors were intensely interested in the birds and animals and flowers around them of Hindustan, and they wrote about them in great length. So on the right, you have a painting from Jahangir's period. And I thought it would be interesting for you all to see this painting that I think Mansoor has made, the great painter, of a dodo. And this was painted around, if I'm not wrong, in the 1640s or so, and because a dodo had been presented to Jahangir, and a few decades later, the dodo had become extinct. So this is possibly the last painting of a living dodo. So I found that so moving when I found that out, and I thought I would share that with you. So these images, this miniature, painting helped me understand that yes, this is the way in which in the 1570s Akbar was experiencing his empire. But this was not all, of course, because at this stage he was also marrying into the great Rajput houses. His first Rajput wife was Harka Bai of Amer from the Kachwaha clan, and she gave birth to Salim, the future Jahangir. And on the right is a painting that depicts this moment. And it is around this time also that the women kind of disappear from Mughal archives. Before this, you have the recordings of the Mughal matriarchs in the time of Babur and Humayun, and even in the early Akbari period. But at around this time, for some reason, the wives get hidden from the narrative. They get hidden behind titles. They are given names like Maryam Uz-Zamani, which is the name for Harkabai, or Maryam Makani, which was a name for Hamida Banu, and they don't talk about them at all in the narratives. They are only described as very chaste women, and this puzzled me to wonder how did this influence come into the Mughals, whereas their earlier women, the Timurid women, were actually quite relatively free. And I sort of see a connection between the Rajput influence, because the Rajput houses at this time were already practicing polygamy. The problem of many wives and their entourages had become a real problem for the great Rajput houses, and they had started keeping their women in a zanana, in a parda. So I think that these two houses, the Mughal system and the Rajput system, interacted with each other and exacerbated this problem of having to keep the women hidden in a very chaste space. So on the right, even though you have a nice painting of Harka Bai there in the middle, and probably sitting next to her is her mother-in-law, Hamida Banu Begum. What happens with time is that we forget the name of this woman, what she was like, and we sort of given to a Bollywoodization of Harka Bai, and she becomes Jodha Bai somehow, which is a great confusion because Jodha Bai was never Akbar's wife; she was Salim's wife. She was a princess of Jodhpur. So the Rajput women were often named from the clan that they came from or the city that they came from. So this sort of confusion arose, and people sort of completely and entirely forgot about the real identities of the women of Akbar's wives. And to sort of solve this problem, I had on the one hand Gulbadan's account, but I also had the writings of Abdul Qadir Badauni. If you remember in the beginning, I told you that in addition to Abu al-Fazl, there was also this man called Badauni. And Badauni, though he was an extremely erudite man, cerebral man, and he was a great translator at Akbar's court, he never rose in the service the way Abu al-Fazl did. And he became, by the end of his life, very bitter. And he blamed a lot of Akbar's experiments in religion on his wives. So he very openly wrote about this, where none of the other writers would do this. So he wrote things like the Pacha has always been in the company of his Rajput wives, and therefore he is very influenced by them. Even his diet is influenced by them. He will not eat onion. He will not eat garlic. He wears the holy thread around his wrist. He puts a tika on his head. He worships fire. So he very clearly lists all these things that, according to him, the Rajput wives are responsible for. So it was very interesting for me to have this counter narrative to Abu al-Fazl, to understand that perhaps some of Akbar's influences did indeed come from his Rajput wives. What else was happening at this time? Of course, all the religious experimentation was happening at Fatehpur Sikri. In fact, Fatehpur Sikri was being built in the 1570s. And if you have a look at this amazing gateway, which was at the time the greatest in Asia, you are told that it's a victory tower. It was built after the great Gujarat victories, to celebrate their victories. But then if you look at part of the writing in it, there's this extraordinary bit of writing which says, "The world is a bridge. Pass over it, but build no houses upon it. He who hopes for a day may hope for eternity." But the world endures but for an hour, spend it in prayer, for the rest is unseen. Now, this is a very unusual sort of writing to be writing on a victory tower. You know, it doesn't have the bombast of a usual victory tower writing. And in fact, this comes from the recordings in the Quran, in Islamic literature, of Jesus' sayings, you know. So this tells us that actually there's something quite different happening in Fatehpur Sikri, that there are Christian influences perhaps seeping into the court as well. And if you look at Fatehpur Sikri in detail, unfortunately, a lot of the wall paintings are now degraded and no longer exist. But a scholar called Saeed Nadeem Rizavi has done amazing work on these. He's recorded them, taken photographs of them, and you can see that initially the entire inner surfaces of Fatehpur Sikri, all the buildings were covered in art, and they were often iconic art, you know, art with images of human beings, of fairies, of angels, as well as animals. So again, something very different from a classical Islamic sort of building that we may have, imagined. So this builds in and adds to my knowledge of what I am saying about Akbar's religious experimentations, which of course is supported by miniatures such as this, which show the two Jesuit priests dressed in black at Akbar's court, in addition to, of course, the Jains, the Brahmins, and all sorts of Sunnis and Shia, all sorts of religious thinkers. Now, in phase 3, in the 1580s, we come to these wonderful manuscripts that are made, which are the Persian translation for the first time of the holy texts of the Brahmins, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Now, at that time, there was nobody who could understand both these languages. So Akbar set up a Maktab Khana, which was a translation bureau in which he brought Brahmin priests and Persian scholars, and they interacted with each other over days to understand the meaning of these texts. And they translated these texts into Persian and illustrated them. And here you have on the left a page from the Ramayana. Here you have Ram and Lakshman seated under a tree, with perhaps Hanuman in front of them. And on the right, you have a scene from the Mahabharata. And these became immensely popular amongst the Persian elite, among the courtiers, among the harem women, and also among the other sub-imperial courts of the Rajputs, for example. And a little later, the Rajputs, having seen these works, decided themselves to commission their own works of illustrated Ramayana. And this on the left is Raja Jagat Singh's great Mewar Ramayana. On the right is a copy of Hamida Banu Begum's Ramayana. So even Akbar's mother was very fond of these stories, and she had her own personal copy of the Ramayana. So it helped me understand what these people were reading, what they were interested in, and the way in which this information was spreading from the court even to the other sub-imperial states. What else was happening at this time? Now, Harka Bai's nephew was Raja Mansingh. He became Raja on the death of his father, and in 1599 he built this amazing temple in Vrindavan, and it was the largest temple that had been built in North India for several centuries at this time. And if you look at it carefully, you will see that there are no, it is an iconic temple from the outside. There are no icons, no idols, no figures at all. And it is made of red sandstone, which is what was happening also at Fatehpur Sikri. But perhaps out of consideration for his, Muslim monarch, he hasn't built any idols on the outer surface of the temple, though inside there are many icons. And also, this temple carried out traditions which were happening at the Mughal court, such as the Naubat, which is the playing of the orchestra whenever the idols were taken out and presented to the people, almost in a Jharoka darshan, which is what Akbar was doing in the court. What else was Raja Mansingh? Now, he was the most successful and one of the greatest mansabdars of Akbar. And towards the end of his reign, he was in Bihar, in Rohtas, and he built this amazing, huge fort there. And he inscribed it in the front with this double inscription. If you can have a look here, on the right is the Persian inscription, on the left next to it is the Sanskrit one. And in the Persian inscription, it's addressed to Emperor Sultan Jalaluddin Muhammad Pasha Ghazi, and it blandly mentions the Raja as having built a strong building. Nothing else is said about Raja Mansingh. But on the left, which is the Sanskrit inscription, which is meant for his audience, his people, the Hindu, perhaps Brahmins and priests and other people, the Sanskrit inscription doesn't mention the Pacha at all. And instead, it celebrates Raja Mansingh as being Maharaj, Adhiraja Maharaja, head of the Kachwaha clan. So it was very interesting for me to see this dual reality in which Raja Mansingh was able to negotiate his reality, which was both being a Hindu Rajput Raja and also a Mughal Mansabdar. So he was able to do it in this way. Now, in phase 4, Akbar, there are much fewer battles now. You know, the state is very settled. The country is more peaceful. And at this time, in the late 1580s, early 1590s, Akbar decides that he wants a great biography of his life written. And this is the Akbarnama. And many of the images I've taken are from this book. On the right, you can see Abu al-Fazl presenting a copy of the Akbarnama to Akbar. Now, this Akbarnama, this biography of Akbar, is unusual in many, many ways. In one way, right in the beginning, normally genealogies of Muslim kings start from invocating Allah, and then they go on to Prophet Muhammad and all the caliphs, and then little by little they come to the present king. But in this book, there's no real mention of Allah. It is more Ilahi, which is the divinity factor. So divinity is praised, Ilahi is praised, and then you skip Prophet Muhammad altogether, you skip the caliphs altogether, and instead you go on to Adam, from Adam and Eve. So you go on to Adam, and then you come through various kings, and you come to Akbar. So it is almost as if Akbar is being presented as the Pacha of all humanity, not just an Islamic king. Apart from this fact, I wanted to show you this image, which is really, it shows, the Mughal painting at its apogee at this stage, the apex of what they were able to achieve under Akbar. It is such a beautifully balanced image. The colors are so Hindustani in their use of colors, much more vivid than the Persian soft pastels that were usually used. And also they have continued to use the Persian horizontal use of space, but yet there is a sense of depth here. As you can see, the images on the top are much smaller, so you get a sense of depth, which the early Persian paintings were not able to convey. So here you can see that the artists have learned from the European paintings which were landing up at their court. And finally, in the fifth phase, we have what the art historian Kavita Singh from JNU has described as a deluxe manuscript. So this was much later on, in the late 1590s, that Akbar starts commissioning these sorts of works. Now, these are works which are illustrations of some of their favorite writers, such as Amir Khusro. So here we have illustrated an anecdote, a story in which a king has accidentally killed a young man, and the young man's mother is coming to the king to ask for justice. And the king says, you can take you can see there are two baskets at his feet, and he says you can either take this basket which is full of gold, or you can take the empty basket and I will fill it with my head. I will cut off my own head to beg for forgiveness. And if you look at the old woman very carefully, can you see that she might remind you of another famous iconic figure, which is Mother Mary, with her blue robes and her sad-looking face. This is something that the Mughal painters had learned from all the paintings that the Jesuits and the Europeans were bringing, showing Jesus and Mary, which was very, very popular at the court. So the Mughal artists were able to very, elegantly able to use different styles. So for the mother, they have used Mother Mary because she's a piteous person. She's somebody who's pleading for her son, who shows the great agony of the death of her son. And the king is shown in a much more classical Mughal way, and he in fact looks a lot like Akbar. So this painting really shows how Mughal artists were able to manipulate different techniques depending on what they wanted to interpret and what they wanted to show to their readers. Now, this work of art is actually tiny. It is only a few inches across. And this is so very different. If you remember, I told you in the beginning, the Hamzanama was a huge work of art, 1 meter tall, the paintings. This is tiny. So for me, it shows how at this stage of his life, having completed, all his battles and his conquests, Akbar is in a much more contemplative, intimate space in his mind. He holds these paintings in his hands. It is a personal experience for him, and he engages with these paintings on a very different level from the Hamzanama paintings of the earlier period. What else is happening here? The same Raja Mansingh has built a temple, but look at how different it is now. This temple is built in the memory of his eldest son who dies unexpectedly at around this time. It is called the Jagat Shiromani temple outside Amer. And this time, since it is a personal temple, it is built to commemorate the death of his favorite son. It is his wife, Rani Kanakwati, who has come up with the idea of this temple. And this temple is full of icons because it serves a different purpose for the Raja. Now, in this very last phase, I wanted to show you this very interesting work of art. It is called a Maraca. It is a little bit, so these are not individual paintings, though they look like it from afar. These are almost like scrapbooks, like imperial scrapbooks. Each of these here on the left is a different image. This is a little like a Timurid prince, a classic Persian Timurid prince. Here you have perhaps a Sufi. Here you have maybe a scholar, and here obviously a European influenced painting. Here again are 4 different sets of painting which have been put together like a scrapbook, but very carefully curated and thought over and put together. And who was making this amazing scrapbook, this amazing Maraca, in which something is trying to be said? Because if a Timurid prince is being used, and this is something very different from Akbar's sense of sovereignty. And in fact, this does not belong to Akbar's atelier. This is one of Salim's works. Now, Salim was his eldest son, and he's no longer a young man now in the early 1600s. In fact, he's almost a middle-aged man, and his sons are also now young men themselves. And Akbar favors his son. So Salim is in a very dangerous position. He feels that he is being left out of the line of succession, and that his sons are being favored over himself. And so, for me, these Maracas that Salim begins to create from the time that he is a prince earlier on, for me, it's a way, I think this is a way in which Salim challenged his father. He was not able to challenge him on the battlefield. He was not as good a commander of men, not as charismatic. And in no other way was he the equal of his father. But in the field of arts, he believed he was the equal to his father. And he made this amazing, Maraca, in which I think he sort of laid down this challenge to his father, saying, that I am a Timurid prince, and so I can also claim sovereignty. An interesting thing happened at this time was that a lot of the painters disappeared from Akbar's court, and many of the younger ones, especially who had grown up with Salim, went over to Salim's courts, and Salim set up an independent court for himself in Allahabad. And this particular painter, Farooq Beg, a very enigmatic painter, he was initially with Akbar, but around 1597 he disappears from Akbar's court and goes to the Deccan down south, where he paints this amazing painting of Ibrahim Adil Shah of the Deccan. And then after Akbar's death, sometime in 1606 or 1607, he comes back to Salim, to Jahangir by then, and enters Jahangir's atelier. So I wonder if he didn't leave the court at this time because of these tensions in the artists surrounding the question of which atelier to join, Akbar's or Salim's. And finally, this final portrait, painted in 1600, shows Jahangir as a king himself, as a pacha. So he calls himself Shah Salim. And in this painting, he shows to his father that he is considering himself a king. He is challenging him. He starts minting his own coins. He starts reciting the Friday prayers in his own name. And so this is his challenge to his father. And indeed, a very few years after this, Akbar dies, and Jahangir does manage to become Pacha Jahangir. But in this painting, we see that he, in fact, claims to be emperor much before this, even in the 1600s. So I will end my talk with you there, and I hope you have lots of questions to ask me. We have, I think, 10-12 minutes for that.
Yeah, great. So there have been a couple of questions coming in. So Ujjwala, can we start with you if you've taken note of the questions?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the first question that we have is that the person says that the fact about Jodha Bhai was rather unknown. How come books say that she's his wife?
That Jodha Bhai was Akbar's wife, and actually now we know that most likely she was Jahangir's wife. Yeah. So how come that so many books still tend to assume that Akbar's Rajput wife was Jodha Bhai?
Yeah, so I think one of the problems is that very little was known of Akbar's Rajput wives. A lot of effort went into hiding them. In fact, even hiding their names. Since she was called Maryam Uz-Zamani, we forgot what her real name was. I think in the official records, there's only in the hundreds and hundreds of official records and writing, there's only one direct reference which says her name was Harka Bai. So she became forgotten. Her actual name was forgotten. And Jodha Bai, for some reason, caught the popular imagination. The Bollywood film was made despite the fact that they were told by historians that this is not true. And somehow it stayed in people's imagination, and this romantic love story became fact for people. But it comes from the fact that they were hidden. Yeah.
I think Mughal-e-Azam played a huge role in this. I mean, an iconic film, and of course, right through the film, we know that Jodha Bai is Salim's mother, Akbar's wife. So yeah, that I think in the 60s, that really caught people's imagination. Of course, then we had the later film Jodha Akbar as well, which sort of cemented this deal for so many. So how history can kind of change over time and change people's perspective depending on how popular the medium is, I guess.
That's right. And the effort that goes into, not a lot of effort goes into elucidating women's history. So that's also a problem.
Yes. Reet, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is, what is the interpretation of miniature paintings based on?
So the interpretation of miniature paintings, this is a stream of its own. Art history is a completely, separate subject that people are studying. So, for example, if you look at this last painting, which is, Shah Salim enthroned, Kavita Singh talks about it in her book in great detail. So she looks at the symbolism, she looks at the animals on the painting. They all represent, royalty or mythical animals, which are always associated with royalty. So they look at the symbol, they look at the writing very carefully. He's calling himself Shah. That means, he has some claims to sovereignty. They're looking at the way he's sitting, he's holding his hand means something specific. So the art historians have a very complex set of codes which tell them, and they use these interpretative techniques and set it in time, and then we can bring out an analysis based on them. But it's done with a lot of vigor, and it's a very exciting field.
Yes. One of the questions that came up a little earlier, and I think one of the boys asked from our school, Athar. I think what his question means is how have these paintings survived down? I mean, if we look at Mughal history, after Aurangzeb, we see this very steady decline in the fortunes of the Mughal Empire. And when we look at these ateliers, they require a lot of support and money. And we know that Aurangzeb was kind of pulling back from supporting a lot of these activities. And post his rule, with the Mughal Empire facing reverses from multiple fronts. How are they able to kind of preserve these these amazing works of art? I mean, the manuscript, the writing itself is such a work of art. I mean, the paintings, of course.
They are wonderful works of art. So the Mughal works themselves, a lot of them were destroyed. In fact, what we have is probably a fraction of what is left, especially under Nadir Shah in 1739 and then in 1857. That's where the Mughal library, let us say, in the Red Fort, Shah Jahanabad. So it was destroyed on 2 separate occasions and many more occasions after that in looting and destruction. So many things were lost. We have lost a lot. What happened then was that when the British were here and they saw what was there at the Mughal library, they took a lot of that as loot and took that back to the UK. This is why now a lot of our work lying in the British Library, in the Victoria and Albert Museum, in some of the US libraries. So they have been preserved abroad in these libraries because they were taken out of the country, but a lot were destroyed. What happened also post all this phase of destruction of the Mughal Empire is that a lot of the artists then went into the sub-imperial courts. So we have the Awadhi schools, we have the Rajput schools. It was actually Mughal-trained painters who then went on to these schools and brought their techniques and fused them with the local styles and then produced other works of art that were then retained in those houses. So the clan, for example, in Jaipur, you have lots of amazing manuscripts in the museums there because their courts were then able to sponsor this kind of painting once the Mughal Empire was no longer able to. But a lot was, to come back to your question, a lot was destroyed. Like Gulbadan's biography, that is only half of her biography that is left. Half was destroyed, we have never found.
Yeah, I think Aparna had asked this question that how many have any miniatures from Gulbadan Begum's uh, Humayunama, how much of that has survived? So I think that answers Aparna's question as well.
I don't think there were any paintings that survived. I don't know if there were paintings to accompany her, because her Humayunama was almost meant as a primary source for Abu al-Fazl. That Abu al-Fazl will use this as notes to make his great Akbarnama, you see. So I doubt it received the sort of imperial care that an Abu al-Fazl work would have received with the painting. Obviously, that took time and money. So I think hers was just a manuscript, and half of that manuscript was destroyed. So what we have today is just half a manuscript.
Yeah, Ujjwala, next question. Can we take that up?
Yes, ma'am. Srijita Mishra asks, I read somewhere that Anarkali was not really a historical figure. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I know. I have always got to answer the question about Jodhabai and Anarkali. These are two set questions. So I do talk about her a little bit, in Akbar. There's not a great deal that is written at the time by contemporary writers. There's sort of an assumption that Salim was in love with a woman in Akbar's harem, and Akbar was very unhappy with this and eventually had her entombed alive. But I really have not come across anything at all. It was a lot. The Europeans would come and they would listen to a lot of bazaar gossip, because obviously they did not have inroads into the Mughal court. They were not part of that circle. They were a little bit considered as outcasts, slightly unclean, need to be, brought into the inner circles. So they used to get a lot of their information from bazaar rumors and gossip, and there was a lot of gossip around these sort of things because there were a lot of beautiful women in the harem, and there was a lot of tension between Salim and Akbar. But from what I can see and what I have deduced, those tensions were over sovereignty. They were over who is going to be king next. And Akbar played this game constantly of favoring his grandsons, Khurram and Khusro, over Salim. So I think a lot of the tension was due to Salim feeling very insecure with his father about who would be Pasha next. And this tension sort of got translated in bazaar gossip as being over a woman. I find it quite unlikely that these men who were so caught up in these, sovereign considerations would really, come to doing this over a woman and entomb. But certainly, I don't think Akbar would have done that.
I think kind of taking on from when you said that the Europeans were kind of seen as slightly unclean as well. Aryaman asks a question where he says that Ibadat Khan, of course, represented Akbar's pantheistic philosophy, where he was truly and very genuinely interested in learning about other religions. And how is it that he didn't really see them as a religious threat? I mean, is there some background to that?
How did he not see the Christians
as a Christians as a kind of a threat, perhaps, or maybe?
Sorry to interrupt you, but at this time, I think what we need to remember is that the Mughal Empire was the greatest in the world. So there was no question of threat coming. We are seeing it with retrospective eyes, and we know what happened, and we know eventually what happens to the Mughal Empire. But at this time, and certainly from Akbar to Shah Jahan, this period, it is the wealthiest, largest, most glorious empire in the world. People are rushing here. It is not in the other direction. People are rushing here for trade, for riches, to make their fortunes. So Akbar never saw this vaguely as a threat. He saw it as something that he could get information from, because I think he was genuinely interested in ideas, genuinely interested in notions of spirituality and religion, and how to bring about a system in which all the different people of his empire could live in a relatively peaceful situation. So he, in fact, made overtures to the Christians, and for the first time told them, you can build your churches and you can baptize people, you can convert people if they so wish. So this is not the sign of somebody who felt himself under threat in any way.
Yeah, I think Divyansh has an interesting question that how much of Akbar's legacy does Aurangzeb carry forward? I mean, Akbar and Aurangzeb have always been kind of posed as this binary, in a binary situation, that if Akbar was the great, Aurangzeb wasn't such a great person. So how much of Akbar's legacy was Aurangzeb influenced by and decided to carry forward?
These, as you say, these binaries are always very, troublesome, and I don't think you can see anybody, neither Akbar as only great, which is why I've tried to bring out many, many different aspects of his character and show his development through mistakes and other ways in which he developed his empire. Not that I've studied Aurangzeb at great depth, but I would posit that he develops his persona and his power base in relation to Darashikoh. And Darashikoh is somebody who is also like Akbar, playing with the notion of these religious pluralities and is reaching out to Sufis and reaching out to Indian thinkers, and who is, uh, using this as his symbol of sovereignty. So Aurangzeb has to pose himself a little bit opposed to Darashikoh, and when he makes his claim for power, he says, "I am actually the Timurid prince. I am much more like the original Timur, and I am the great Sufi leader. The great Sunni leader for you, and you should follow me. I will bring back a greater purity, let us say, to the state." But I think in many ways, Akbar's state carries on even with Aurangzeb, though he has to cut back in many ways for matters which are much more pragmatic than we realize. Money is running out. He cannot sponsor art and literature the way the earlier, emperors could. And so we get the story that Aurangzeb was very austere. He forbade music. He forbade drinking. But this is not really true. There was a context in which some of this happened, and that's the way in which we have to understand Aurangzeb as also a product of his time.
Thank you so much. I think the weather's really turned at your location, Ira ma'am, because we've kind of lost video contact with you, though we can hear you. And
Yes.
I know the screen is also freezing up. So I think it's really the weather. So I hope our audience kind of just forgives us for that. This is really out of our control. We are almost out of time. We are less than 1 minute away from when we should wind up. So just a few last parting words before we go into the vote of thanks. I have put a link in case you're interested in snagging a signed book, the signed copy of Akbar. You can just fill in the form, which I've also posted in the chat box earlier, and it's also in the description box. Don't forget to follow Ira ma'am on her social media channels. One is on Instagram, where she's at Ira Mukhoty, and also on Twitter, where she's again at Ira Mukhoty. And right now she is, kind of having a run of these Mughal memes, which are really hilarious. So kind of a different take on what's, the dialogue between two people through Mughal paintings. So that's fun to follow. So do follow her. I will put these two handles as well in the description box once we are done with the live show. And any parting advice, Ira ma'am, to the students who are watching here? Many of them are history students, and they're already starting their work on their CBSE projects as to how one should conduct their research, perhaps.
Yes, well, I think for those who are in Delhi, since they are in Delhi, it's very lucky because it's one of the capitals, and we are very rich in architectural, legacies from the Mughals. So they really must go visit, question whatever they are told, look for themselves, look for patterns, look for information, and I would just encourage them to question what they are always told. There's always a different side to the story.
Thank you so much. That was really one amazing hour that we spent. I mean, there's so much to learn. And I've definitely got my electronic copy, of course, of Akbar, but I've also signed up for a signed copy by Ira ma'am. So I'm definitely, I am kind of halfway through your book right now. And there's so much more wealth of information. And Akbar is not like this one king who's named in your textbooks and you have to learn up about for your board exams. But really, he comes out as, a person who's constantly learning as well. He's making mistakes, but he's constantly learning as well, and how he's interacting with the people around him. So that's quite an interesting way of looking at people in the past. And I had, in my opening comments, talked about this scholar from Baghdad who did talk about how reading transports you across time and space to experience a very different time and a life. So definitely reading is one of the best things that we can do during this time of COVID. With this, I hand over to Reet to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Reet Lat, the Vice President of MIIRAAS, Sanskriti School's Heritage Club. On behalf of the school, I sincerely thank Ms. Ira Mukhoty for not only sparing her invaluable time to make this event possible, but also for enlightening us with a new perspective on history. Hearing about your book and about various art forms has encouraged each one of us to know more and read about the history of our country. Ma'am, it was a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
I, I would also like to thank Vasundhara ma'am from Alif Books for arranging signed copies of Miss Ira Mukhoty's book. With a deep sense of appreciation, we thank our principal, Mrs. Richa Sharma Agnihotri, and our senior school in charge, Mrs. Puni Rajesh, for constantly supporting us. I would also like to thank Ms. Sanchita Ghosh for making this event a success. Finally, I will thank all of you for turning up for this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much. Thank you, Ira ma'am, for sparing your valuable time. And to the audience, I would like to say, see you soon again, perhaps with another personality that we can interact with. But keep your questions coming, and if the questions are exciting, we will forward them to Ira ma'am, so that and get the response from her and relay it back right to you. With this, we will end today's broadcast, and bye bye. See you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.